Hey guys, welcome to Ask Truth Apologetics. I'm here today to discuss a couple of Muslim objections, particularly to the apostleship of Paul, and specifically to his three differing accounts when they are told in the book of Acts. So, this is what the Muslim had to say to me. He said, yes, according to Paul, he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, but he is a liar, as he gave three different accounts of that experience. Okay, so he's claiming that in the book of Acts there are three differing accounts when it comes to Paul's conversion story. So, as I mentioned in my YouTube video about if Jesus was crucified, the link will be in the description box. I told you that honest testimonies are going to agree on critical points, but they're going to vary slightly when it comes to some minor details. Okay, so this is going to be the same type of thing here in the book of Acts. So there are three differing accounts in the book of Acts, but they tell the exact same, or essentially the exact same story. So we're going to get into it a little bit, and hopefully you guys can see this for yourself and come to the same conclusion that I have, which is the Bible is reliable, Paul is not a liar, and the three differing accounts in Acts actually strengthen the facts instead of weaken the facts. Okay, so the book of Acts in chapter 9 is where we first learn about Paul in his conversion story. So one thing that I want you guys to know before going into it, Paul, which we know him as today, was Saul, S-A-U-L. So that is what he went by prior to his conversion. So when you hear the word Saul, just think Paul. Okay, so the book of Acts in chapter 9 tells the story of what happened to Paul on the road to Damascus from what Luke, who is the author of Acts, gathered from both Paul and the eyewitnesses of the account. Okay, and so this is basically how the story goes. So in chapter 9, verses 3 through 9, we see that Paul is on his way to Damascus. And it says that, now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what to do, or what you are to do. So the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Okay, so that is the first account that we read about in Acts. So we can talk about the next account that we read about, which is in Acts 22, verses 6 through 11. So this account is when Luke, of course, the author of the book, he's recording the exact words of Paul. And what Paul has just been arrested, and this is Paul telling the people of Jerusalem his conversion story from his own personal account. So you'll notice that there is a bit of a difference between a third-person perspective that Luke's telling the story, and then Luke recording the words of Paul, who is speaking to the people of Jerusalem after one of his arrests. And so this is Paul's firsthand account. So this is Acts 22, verse 6 through 11. So Paul's words, he says, as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise and go into Damascus, and there you'll be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. All right, so that is the second account of Luke. And then we can go into the third account that Luke records in Acts. And this is pretty good. This is going to be a similar type of situation that's going on in Acts 22. It's actually Luke recording the words of Paul. It's a different setting and a different situation. So this is when Paul has been arrested again, and he is now before King Agrippa. And I want you guys to keep in mind that King Agrippa has the ability, he's kind of in a courtroom type of situation. King Agrippa has the ability to condemn Paul to death, sentence him to life in prison, or he has the ability to release him and let him go free. So this is Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. So this is Paul saying to King Agrippa, which is recorded by Luke and in Acts. And he says, "In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.' And I said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And the Lord said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins, and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me.'" Right? So you'll see that the accounts do slightly differ in a couple of ways, but they really are telling essentially the same story. And I'll talk about why they might differ and all those types of things coming up. So Luke records the words of Paul when Paul retells his story in front of the people of Jerusalem, and that's in Acts 22. And then in front of King Agrippa in Acts 26. The collective eyewitnesses accounts won't agree in full detail with Paul, who is, I don't like to use the word victim of the revelation, but he was the one whom was struck by the light, and he was the one who was blinded, right? So his story is going to be a little bit more personalized than third-party perspective, the people who are walking with him. Their testimony is going to vary slightly, probably from his. And you can imagine if you were in the same situation, how if you were the one who was struck by the light, you might have a particular account versus if you were the one who witnessed someone being struck by light, right? So remember that Paul was knocked down, blinded. His story is from his perspective, right? So Luke probably took, so in Acts chapter 9, what most likely happened if Luke was a good historian, which he's a world-class historian, he would have interviewed the eyewitnesses and interviewed Paul, of course, and he would have put together a third-person narrative about what happened, right? So in Acts 22 and 26, Paul is then telling his own stories. So on a side note here, a lot of Muslims like to say that the New Testament has been tampered with, or the Bible has been tampered with, to say that, it's been corrupted in some way, shape, or form. So when we have these minor differing accounts, that would have been a prime reason or a prime spot where if someone were coming back and editing it, or scribes were copying it, they could have harmonized all of those stories, right? It's not as if the people copying this would not have recognized that there were slight variations in the story from Acts 9, 22, and 26. So I'm sure there may have been a temptation to harmonize those accounts into one single story. However, we still have this 2,000 years later, and it's still got a varying account, right? So what does that tell us? That strengthens the integrity of the authors and the editors and the scribes in the New Testament to say that they maintained their integrity. They maintained the integrity of the script. They allowed these things that have slight variations, like here in Acts and even like in the four Gospels. They have those slight variations, and they keep those in there, right? So that shows the honesty of the scribes. All right, so when we read these accounts, we need to determine what is exactly consistent within all of the stories, right? So the one thing we can gather from this is that Paul was a persecutor of the early Christians. All accounts agree with that. All accounts agree that he was on the road to Damascus when he had this experience, and he was on the road to Damascus under the authority and permission of the Jewish leaders or council at the time, with the authority to arrest and persecute Christians whom Paul believed were terrible people, right? Another thing that we can gather from all of this information is that Paul is knocked to the ground, and he is knocked to the ground by what he describes as a bright light. That light speaks to him, and Paul believes that that light, the experience of the light that he had, was the risen Jesus, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Okay, all accounts believe that Paul was blinded for some time. Now, I didn't read all the rest of this, but all accounts also say that he was blinded until a man named Ananias, who was called by the Lord, came and healed him, and then he was healed of his blindness. And all accounts agree that after that, Paul stopped persecuting the Christians. All accounts agree that he stopped that. And all accounts agree that he started actually preaching the gospel to basically everyone, but specifically he was called to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Okay, so what we can conclude with basically historical certainty is that Paul had some sort of experience on the way to Damascus that left him blind for a few days. And that experience changed his mind about who the Christians were, so much so that Paul became one of the Christians. Paul believed that that it was Jesus who was responsible, or was the bright light that shone and spoke to him and commanded him to become an apostle to the Gentiles. And as we all know from history, Paul listened to Jesus, or he listened to the light, who he believed was Jesus, and he became one of the most influential men in the entire world history, and is largely responsible for the spread of global Christianity. So we can conclude that if that experience had not happened, much of what we know today might not have occurred either, right? So God obviously allows these things to happen. So there are some minor differences, and so let's look into that and talk about it a little bit further. So what differences are in connection between all the accounts? So the overall thing to take away is the accounts are all written by the same man, right? So the author of Acts, who is Luke, they're all written by Luke. Okay, so this goes back to integrity here. If Luke's intention was to write a narrative for the sole purpose of promoting Christianity, he may have been tempted to try to harmonize the story of the three different slightly varying accounts of Paul's conversion story, right? But he left the stories as they were told, right? He left them as they were told with a little bit of difference in them. So we can trust that if he's leaving those types of things in here, that he's recording actual historical events and nothing more. I don't think he's necessarily forwarding a Christian narrative, because if he were, why would he leave those accounts slightly differing? Okay, so as I said previously, Acts 9 is told from a third-person historical account perspective. This is Luke retelling the story of what happened, so it's going to be kind of matter-of-factual. Acts 22 is Luke recording Paul's words to the Jewish people after one of his arrests, and Acts 26 is Luke recording Paul's own words to King Agrippa, right? So the question is, did Paul's companions hear the voice or not? That's a highly disputed point. Like in Acts 9, the narrative, so did Paul hear did he see the light? Did his companions see the light or not? Would Paul know if his companions saw or heard or anything like that? I don't know, because he may have been shocked from the experience. And maybe he's only going based on assumption and not necessarily factual information. We would expect from a third person perspective, like in Acts 9, that the narration or the narrative would be shorter and more matter of fact. But it speaks more matter of factly, right? And from Paul's perspective, we might expect the story to have a little bit more personalized feel to it and a little bit more personal details included in that story. And I'm going to read these different things again, and I want you to consider this while I'm reading it, okay? So is this what we see? So from Acts chapter 9, again, reading this, verses 3 through 9, we see that Luke says, "Now as he," Paul, "went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.' The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul arose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank." So when you guys read this account, and if you read it yourself, if you look at it, it is the shortest of the three accounts. It doesn't go into very much detail. It's just kind of matter-of-factly, right? He's knocked to the ground by a light. These words, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting. Rise and enter the city," right? It's very specific. It's very brief. It's very matter of fact when you read these types of things, all right? So does Paul's personal account vary slightly from the account told by Luke, right? So in Acts 22, he's telling this story to a large crowd, and it's from his own personal perspective. So this is Acts 22, verses 6 through 11. So this is Paul's own words. "As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon," so you'll see he added in a specific hour of time, right? So he's recalling this from his memory, like, I was on my way, it was probably about noon, and all of a sudden a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting.'" So far this is pretty similar to Acts 9, the words and things like that, but he adds in that minor detail. "Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me." Okay, so this is where he's saying, those around me saw it, they didn't understand, blah, blah. He's speaking about this from his own perspective. He's not talking about it as a matter of fact. He's speaking about it kind of from his own recollection and memory. "And I said, 'Lord, what shall I do?' And the Lord said to me, 'Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do.' And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and I came into Damascus." All right, so what do we see here? We see a much more personalized story. Paul is remembering specific things like the time of day, and it's a little bit more descriptive about what happened to him, and even the details about kind of what the men were experiencing from his perspective around him. Okay, so here's the comparison. From Acts 9, the men saw the light and heard a voice. From Acts 22, the men saw the light and didn't understand the voice. So you can go, well, they didn't understand and they heard the voice. And those are different ways of saying it, right? But here's my question. Is it actually a differing account? Well, not really, right? Because hearing a voice does not necessarily mean that they understood the voice, right? We've all heard people speaking to us, and if they speak in a different language, or if we're just dazed and confused or something, we're not paying attention, we can hear them but not understand them. Okay, so just because they didn't hear the voice or they didn't understand the voice doesn't mean they didn't hear it, right? And when Paul says they didn't understand the voice, well, not understanding a voice by implication says that they heard a voice, right? So it's just a little bit more of a personalized detail that Paul throws in there. So really Acts 9 and Acts 22 don't differ with each other in any major way. So Acts 26 is told in front of King Agrippa and is the longest narration of the story. Okay. Does it make sense that the more in-depth retelling of the account would be in front of the king, right? Remember, because the king had the power, King Agrippa had the power to condemn Paul to death and to set him free. So this is more in a courtroom type of setting. So is Paul's account reflective of the situation that he is in? Let's think about that when we read that. So this is Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, right? So you'll notice that Paul is adding in a couple of details here, saying that he was under the authority. He was doing these things under the authority of the chief priests. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven. And he describes it a little bit more in depth and in detail here than he has in the previous way. And he says that light was brighter than the sun that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew, right? So he adds this additional detail in here that when Jesus was speaking to him, it wasn't Aramaic or Greek, it was actually in Hebrew. Saul, Saul, he says, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I appeared to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So the longest and most detailed account is when he is in front of King Agrippa. Now, does that make sense that you would include a lot more details about what you specifically were doing? So you notice that he included the details of the fact that he was under the commission of the authorities, that he was able to do that. He's saying, I was able to do this. I was going to persecute these things under the authority. And he goes into a little bit more specific detail about the voice that he was hearing, that it was spoken about in the Hebrew. And you have to keep in mind, he was arrested for preaching the gospel, right? So he's also including more words that he learned from Jesus in his narrative, saying, look, I've been given the authority by Christ to be doing exactly what I'm doing. So he's simultaneously defending himself, but he is also promoting the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ, because you'll see in here that he says, that God has basically said, follow Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins and sanctification by faith in Christ. So in this more official setting, Paul acts a little bit more officially. Okay, so a couple of interesting things that you might also notice is Paul kind of leaves out some of the minor details that he left in because Paul is not there with the witnesses that are around him, so he doesn't mention them as much, right? So Paul doesn't mention that the people around him heard the voice or didn't hear a voice. He does say that there was a light that shone around them, but he doesn't even include if they saw the light or not. And that's because he's focusing more on his personal story in front of Agrippa so that people can understand why he's doing what he is doing. Okay? So just kind of, I'm going to leave you guys with an open question. So does the version of Paul's story from Acts 26 contradict Acts 22 or Acts 9 in any way, shape, or form? Does it contradict? Does he say something the exact opposite of what the other one is? No, not in the least. There's not a differing account, right? Could Luke have simply copied the story from Acts 9? All right, so Acts 9 is the shortest, most concise version of the story. So could Luke have just copied it and essentially plugged it right into Acts 22 and Acts 26? Well, yeah, and that would have actually been the easier thing for him to do, and we wouldn't have been thinking about these slightly varying accounts, right? But again, because Luke includes these slightly varying accounts, we can rely on him as an honest historian with great integrity to be including all of these things, right? Because it takes more effort for Luke to record everything that Paul said accurately in all those different ways. Okay, so thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, make some comments, things like that. It helps this type of information get out to the general public. I hope it blessed you in some way, shape, or form. And like always, if you have any questions or would like to bring up any objections for clarification, I'll be more than happy to field those questions from you. But until then, know something really important. Jesus loves you. Have a good one, guys.